The smell hit Raymond Cole before he reached the field. October 1983, Saline County, Missouri, and the air carried something mineral and cold. The scent of raw earth turned inside out, of soil stripped from everything it had ever held. He stood at the fence line in the gray pre-sunrise light, his hands on the top wire, and looked at 340 acres of his father's farm, or what was left of it. The rains had come in 3 waves that September. The first moved through on a Tuesday, ordinary enough, 2.5 inches that pooled in the low corners and drained by morning. The second arrived 6 days later and stayed 4 days, 17 inches across Saline County, according to the gauge at the Marshall Cooperative. The third wave was the one that ended something. 9 hours, 11 inches, and the small creek that crossed the southeast quarter of his property, Corbin Creek, which his father had dammed in 1944 to create a stock pond, became something else entirely. It jumped its banks 40 yards on the north side. It moved 3 feet laterally across the bottomland, and when it finally receded on the 22nd of September, it left behind what Raymond spent his first hour at the fence line trying to understand. He was 64 years old. He had farmed this ground for 38 years, taking the deed from his father in the spring of 1945, when the elder Cole came home from the Pacific with hands that no longer gripped a plow correctly. Raymond knew every acre in the particular way a man knows a face, not just the broad features but the small, consistent things. The way a certain corner held moisture 2 days longer than everywhere else. The way the northwest field responded a week earlier each spring because it faced south-southwest and caught afternoon light differently. He had never lost a crop. He had come close 4 times. This was different from close. He owed $89,000 to First National Bank of Marshall. The note had been restructured twice since 1979, when interest rates climbed past 18%, and he had reduced his corn acreage and taken on soybeans to cover the gap. The restructured payment was $11,400 per year, due each November. He had made that payment without exception. But what the September rains had done to his bottom ground, his best ground, the 160 acres of river loam bottomland that produced his strongest yields, changed the calculation entirely. The topsoil was gone, not damaged, not depleted, gone. In the southeast quarter and parts of the south field, the flood current had stripped the surface to depths ranging from 4 inches to, in one long scouring channel near the creek bend, 8 inches. What remained was the subsoil, pale, tight, clay-heavy B-horizon material that held water poorly, drained poorly, and would produce, by Raymond's estimate and by any honest agronomist's estimate, somewhere between 12 and 22 bushels of corn per acre in an optimal season. His previous average on that ground had been 91 bushels. He had 40 acres of highland ground that had survived intact. The rest of the 340 was bottom, and most of the bottom was now subsoil. If he planted the spring of 1984 on what remained, and yielded what the ground could actually support, he would not make the November payment. He had spoken to his banker, Dennis Howell, the previous Friday, and Howell had not been unkind but had been direct. If the appraisal reflected the soil loss, the collateral value of the farm dropped significantly. Howell had used the phrase loan in jeopardy. Raymond drove home and did not tell his wife, Charlotte, what Howell had said. 340 acres. His father's name on the original deed. His own name on every improvement built since 1945. An $89,000 note due in 13 months. That was the shape of what he stood looking at in the October cold. 2 days after he stood at that fence line, Raymond drove 12 miles north to the University of Missouri Extension Service office in Marshall. He waited 30 minutes in a plastic chair and then sat across from the county agricultural extension agent, a man named Dr. Gordon Hatch, 38 years old, who had taken the position in 1980 with a doctorate in soil science from the University of Missouri-Columbia. Hatch listened. He looked at the field survey Raymond had hand-drawn on graph paper, showing the zones of soil loss by quarter acre. He nodded twice. Then he said, "Mr. Cole, at the level of topsoil loss you're describing across that acreage, you are essentially farming subsoil for the foreseeable future. The standard protocol is to rest the ground, apply significant quantities of commercial nitrogen and phosphorus, and rebuild organically over a minimum of 8 to 12 years." Raymond asked how much that protocol would cost per acre per year. Hatch wrote a number on a pad and slid it across the desk. It was $240 per acre per year in inputs alone. Raymond said, "I've got 160 acres affected." Hatch said, "Yes, I know what that number means." Raymond folded the graph paper and returned it to his shirt pocket. He stood. He said, "Thank you," and left. That afternoon, Hatch called his colleague at the University Extension office in Sedalia and described the situation. He used the phrase write-off situation, specifically that. Two farmers who had come in for unrelated business heard the call through the thin wall between the waiting area and Hatch's office. By that evening, the phrase had reached the feed store at the edge of Marshall. What none of them knew, what Hatch with his doctorate did not know, what Dennis Howell at the bank did not know, what the men at the feed store did not know, was that Raymond Cole had not come to Marshall for advice. He had come to find out what the official position was, so he would know exactly how much distance separated it from what he intended to do. Raymond's father, Chester Cole, had farmed the same ground from 1941 until 1945 and kept a record of everything. Not a journal in the literary sense, Chester had not been a literary man, but a series of green-covered composition notebooks, 40 cents each at the Marshall dime store, filled with observations in cramped pencil handwriting. Dates, rainfall measurements, soil temperature readings taken at 4 inches and 8 inches, crop performance by quarter-acre plot. Chester began these records in 1937, when he still farmed rented ground in Cooper County, and continued them until his hands failed him in 1955, and he moved into the house in town. Raymond had inherited 14 of those books. He kept them in an old metal ammunition box under the workbench in the machine shed. In the third week of October 1983, he pulled out the volume dated 1941-1943 and read the entry for spring 1943, when Corbin Creek had jumped its banks for the first time in Chester Cole's tenure, and laid a quarter-inch of gray silt across the southeast corner of the low field. Chester had written, Creek flood left good mud, particle size small and even, came from upstream limestone and loam country. This is not debris. This is deposit. Every flood that has ever run through this valley for 10,000 years put something down when it slowed. The farmers who lost their bottom to the 1927 flood were the ones who didn't look at what the river left behind. The ones who looked planted into the silt the next season and outproduced their neighbors by 30%. The silt carries what topsoil is made of. It carries it from somewhere else and leaves it here. A flood doesn't take your ground. It moves it. Your job afterward is to move it back. Raymond read that entry twice. He turned the page. Chester had written temperatures, rainfall, and yield figures for the following season on that quarter-acre. 97 bushels of corn, where the average field had produced 71. In 1943, on ground that had been covered in creek silt. He closed the book and sat on the workbench stool for a long time. Outside, the machine shed smelled of diesel and old grease, an October cold coming through the gaps in the siding. The 1954 Farmall Super M stood in the first bay, red paint worn to bare metal on the fenders and the hood. The tires replaced in 1979, still holding pressure. He had rebuilt the carburetor in 1981. He had aligned the front axle in 1982. The tractor ran as cleanly as it had 30 years earlier because Raymond maintained it on a written schedule taped to the inside of the toolbox lid. Oil every 100 hours. Coolant flush every spring, rear axle seal checked monthly in working season. He looked at the tractor. He looked at the composition book in his hand. Then he went to the phone on the wall and called his neighbor, Carl Tibbs, 71 years old, who had farmed the land immediately to the north for 43 years. He said, "Carl, come look at something in the morning." It was not a question. Carl said he would be there at 6. They walked the bottom ground together at first light on a Tuesday in late October. The frost had hardened the exposed subsoil to a pale crust that crumbled underfoot. Carl walked quietly, the way Carl always walked fields, hands in his coat pockets, eyes down, reading the ground the way other men read print. Raymond did not explain what he was thinking. He walked to the first zone of silt deposit near the inside curve of the creek bend, where the floodwater had slowed and dropped its load. The silt there was 18 inches deep at the low center, tapering to 2 inches at the edges. It had dried to a gray-brown surface, fine-grained, almost silky underfoot. Raymond crouched and pressed his palm flat against it, then lifted his hand. The material clung in a thin film, fine as flour. Carl stopped beside him and looked at the deposit. "How far does this run?" Carl said. "3 deposits like this one," Raymond said, "plus a line along the north bank shallower, maybe 6 inches, and whatever's in the creek channel itself hasn't settled yet." Carl was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your daddy wrote something about this." "He did," Raymond said. That was the full conversation. They walked back to the farmhouse, drank coffee in the kitchen, and Carl drove north to his own ground. Raymond went to the machine shed and began calculating. The 3 primary silt deposits covered approximately 4 acres in total volume. The creek channel held additional material that would take several weeks to settle enough to collect. The silt was not uniform. The deposit near the creek bend was deepest and finest grained. The one at the edge of the south field was shallower and mixed with organic debris from upstream. What Chester's journal suggested, and what Raymond's reading of the 1943 yield figures confirmed, was that the silt needed spreading at a controlled depth across the stripped acreage, worked into the existing subsoil without burying it under a single thick layer that would shed water. 2 inches. That was the figure Chester had recorded, based on what he had observed of the 1927 survivors downstream. 2 inches of silt worked to a depth of 6 inches with a disc harrow, allowing the fine particles to move down into the capillary structure of the subsoil and begin building a new interface layer. 2 inches across 160 acres required more silt than the 3 deposits currently held. He calculated the volume available against the volume required. The deficit was significant. He would need to collect additional silt from the creek channel once it settled, from the low corners of neighboring fields if those neighbors would allow it, and from secondary channels running off Corbin Creek to the south. He would need to move silt across the farm without compacting the subsoil beneath it, which meant keeping the farmall off the stripped zones wherever possible, and using shallow, temporary diversion channels to direct additional silt flow toward the low areas if winter rains cooperated. He typed a letter to Dennis Howell at First National Bank, explaining that he intended to plant in spring and had a management plan for the affected ground. He did not describe the plan in detail. He attached a 1-page yield projection showing conservative targets for 1984, conservative by what he believed the silt application could support. Howell called 4 days later and extended the review period to March. By the second week of November 1983, Raymond had moved the first deposit using a front-end loader bucket welded to the farmall's hydraulic linkage, an adapter he and Carl had fabricated in 1971 for a different purpose entirely, which no longer appeared on any equipment list at the extension office. The silt moved cleanly. He spread it across the first 20 acres of stripped ground using the pattern Chester's journal had described as staggered rows, driving east-west passes, offsetting each load drop by 30 feet, allowing the material to lie in windrows that the disc harrow would work down later. Loading and spreading, the first deposit took 11 days, starting each morning in the dark and stopping when afternoon temperatures dropped below freezing. The men at the feed store knew he was doing something. Pete Alderman, who had run the bulk fertilizer accounts and sold Raymond his inputs for 11 years, heard from a truck driver that Cole was moving dirt with his old farmall in the frozen fields. Alderman mentioned it one afternoon in early December to 3 other farmers. One of them said, "What's he doing moving dirt in December?" Alderman said, "Damned if I know, probably lost his head over that loan." Nobody laughed exactly, but nobody disagreed. Raymond's youngest daughter, Susan, drove out from Columbia the first weekend of December and stood in the kitchen watching her father mark positions on a hand-drawn field map. She said, "You want me to help?" He said, "No." She drove back to Columbia. The second deposit at the edge of the south field yielded shallower material, 4 to 6 inches deep across roughly an acre and a half, mixed with dead grass and leaf matter from the upstream corridor. Raymond sorted the organic debris out by hand where it was concentrated, leaving the finer silt beneath. It added 4 days to the November timeline. He adjusted. December brought frost hard enough to seal the subsoil surface. Raymond shifted to the creek channel itself, where the silt had settled to a workable consistency by the third week of December, firm enough to excavate but not yet frozen through. He worked the channel edges with the farmaul and the loader bucket, cutting from the outside banks inward, careful not to alter the channel geometry enough to redirect the flow path permanently. Chester's journal contained a single line about this: "Don't change where the water goes, just take what it left." Raymond had read that line perhaps 30 times since October. By the first week of January 1984, he had collected and staged approximately 70% of the silt volume he needed. The ground was frozen solid, and no further spreading would happen until late February. He used January to rebuild the disc harrows bearing assemblies. The original 1968 Craws unit had bearing races beginning to show wear on 3 right-side gangs. He replaced them himself across 3 evenings in the machine shed, the space heated by a single kerosene space heater that smelled of fuel burning against cold metal. Dr. Hatch from the extension office drove past the south field twice in January. He saw the windrows of silt lying across the stripped acreage and interpreted what he saw as a standard soil stabilization attempt, common practice, not what it actually was. His assessment of Raymond Cole's situation remained unchanged. In a quarterly communication to the University of Missouri Cooperative Extension Service, he noted that several bottomland operations in Saline County were in serious distress following the September floods and were unlikely to recover without significant outside intervention. Raymond read none of this. He continued working. The late February thaw came 12 days earlier than average in 1984. Raymond began spreading the staged silt on February 24th, working in the early morning cold when the surface was firm enough to support the tractor at the field edges without compacting the subsoil beneath. He spread from the outside inward on each zone, building the layer outward from the creek side where the ground had dried longest. The 2-inch application depth required checking with a steel probe every 4th pass. A piece of fence rod Raymond had cut in the fall, filed with notches at 2 inches and 4 inches that he could feel through his glove with his thumb. He checked it and adjusted every pass. In the 3rd week of March, he ran the 1968 Craws disc harrow across the first 20 acres of silt-covered ground. The blades cut through the silt layer and into the subsoil beneath at a setting of 5.5 inches, working the fine silt particles down into the pale clay subsoil and beginning the mixing process that Chester's journal said would take 4 to 6 weeks to show results. The disc ran smoothly on the rebuilt bearings. Raymond drove each pass at the same speed his father had used on this ground, 3.5 miles per hour in second gear, close enough to low for control, fast enough to move the material correctly. By early April, he had disked the full 160 affected acres. He planted corn on April 18, 1984, using Pioneer 3377, a mid-maturity corn belt variety with reasonable drought tolerance and a proven yield ceiling on good ground. He planted at 28,000 seeds per acre, the same population he used everywhere on the farm. He applied no additional commercial nitrogen to the silt-covered zones. He applied a standard phosphorus starter at planting, 40 pounds per acre, uniform across the entire farm. That last decision, no added nitrogen on the silt zones, was the one that, when it became known later, struck people most forcefully. The standard protocol for damaged ground was to flood it with nitrogen to compensate for depleted organic matter. Raymond had applied none, because Chester's journal had been specific. The silt carries its own nitrogen load from the upstream material it collected. Add nitrogen and you'll push vegetative growth at the cost of grain. Let the silt work and watch what comes up. Raymond watched. In the second week of May, driving the farmall along the south headland, he stopped the tractor and stepped down. He walked between the rows on the treated ground, crouched, and pressed his palm flat against the soil surface the way he had pressed it against the silt deposit the previous October. He lifted his hand. He turned it over and looked at the thin film that clung there. Then he stood and looked at the row of young corn plants running north across the field. They were darker green than the plants on the untreated highland ground at the north end of the farm. He did not tell anyone. He got back on the tractor and drove to the next row. 2 weeks later, Pete Alderman drove the county road past the south field and looked at the corn from his truck window. He drove to the feed store and told 4 people that Cole's corn was coming in strange. "Too dark," he said. "Looks pushed. He must have bombed it with nitrogen." One of the farmers nodded and said that was the only thing that could explain it. Nobody drove out to look more closely. August came hot and dry, 14 days without rain in late July running into the first week of August, the kind of dry stretch that separated yield potential from actual yield. On the untreated highland ground, Raymond's corn began to show stress. Leaves curling at the tips in the afternoon heat, the root zone working hard to pull moisture from drying soil. He irrigated that ground twice from the stock pond. On the silt-treated bottom ground, the corn did not show stress for 11 days into the dry stretch. He walked the treated zone on a Wednesday morning in late July, 6:30. The temperature already climbing toward 90, the air still and heavy with the smell of corn silk and dry grass. He walked between rows with his hands out at his sides, letting the leaves drag across his fingers, reading the plants the way his father had, checking the color at the growing point, the moisture at the leaf axil, the weight and resistance of the ear as it developed. The ears were firm. The shucks were deep green, not yellowing at the edges. The plant stood upright in a drought that had curled leaves on the highland ground 40 acres north. He calculated. He had seen enough harvests to recognize the shape of a yield, and what he was looking at, the plant population, the ear size at this stage, the color and firmness, was not the shape of 22 bushels per acre. It was not the shape of 45, which would have been a success. It was not even the shape of 70, which he had dared to project to Dennis Howell. He walked back to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table and drank a glass of water. Charlotte was in town. He sat alone and looked at his hands, covered in a fine film of silt dust and corn silk. Then he stood and went back to work. The Saline County combined crews started moving in mid-September 1984. Raymond hired Roy Tanner of Tanner Custom Harvesting out of Sweet Springs, Missouri, a custom operator he had used for 12 years, who ran a pair of 1981 John Deere 7720 combines with green paint still clean on the cab housings. Tanner's crew started on the highland ground on September 17th and finished in 2 days. 89 bushels per acre on the 40 intact acres, consistent with Raymond's 10-year average on that ground. Then they moved to the treated bottom ground. Tanner ran the first pass on the south field on September 19th, in the morning, with the temperature at 62 degrees and the sky white and even. He ran the moisture meter on the first load and called Raymond on the two-way radio. He said the reading was 18.2% moisture, harvestable. He said the test weight was coming in at 57.4 pounds per bushel, above standard grade. He said Raymond should come to the field. Raymond drove the farmall to the headland and climbed the ladder to Tanner's cab. Tanner handed him the yield monitor readout from the first 2 passes. Raymond looked at the number. He handed it back without speaking. Tanner said, "I've been combining this county for 15 years. I've never seen that number on ground that looked like this did last October." The number was 84 bushels per acre. On subsoil, on ground that Gordon Hatch had formally categorized as write-off material, on 160 acres stripped to pale clay, covered in creek silt, worked with a 30-year-old disc harrow, and planted without supplemental nitrogen. 84 bushels per acre. By the time the harvest was complete, the full 160 acres of treated ground averaged 81 bushels per acre. The arithmetic: 12,960 bushels of corn from ground the Extension Office had written off. At the local elevator price of $3.20 per bushel in September 1984, the crop from the damaged ground alone generated $41,472. Combined with the highland ground, Raymond's total farm revenue for 1984 reached $53,968. His November payment to First National Bank of Marshall was $11,400. He made it in full on November 3, 1984. He also had enough to prepay 6 months of interest on the restructured note, the first time he had been ahead of the payment schedule since 1978. Dennis Howell called on November 5th. He said, "Raymond, what did you do out there?" Raymond said, "What needed doing?" Howell said, "I'd like to understand it better." Raymond said he was welcome to come look in the spring. The yield moved through Saline County the way numbers move through farm country, not quickly, not with announcement, but thoroughly. Roy Tanner mentioned it to his next 3 customers while finishing harvest in October. One mentioned it at the elevator. The elevator manager, Gary Putt, told a Pioneer Seeds representative who stopped in that week. The representative noted it in a call report filed the following Monday. Pete Alderman heard the number at the feed store on an October afternoon from a man named Dennis Shear who farmed south of Marshall. Alderman said, "That's not right." Shear said, "That's what Tanner said." Alderman said, "On that ground, without nitrogen." Shear shrugged. A week later, Alderman drove to the Cole farm on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. He parked at the field edge and looked at the stubble on the south field, the corn stover lying flat in the rows, the pale subsoil visible in the wheel tracks at the headland. He stood there for a long time. Then he drove to the house and knocked. Raymond answered. Alderman said, "I want to see the yield tickets." Raymond went inside and came back with the envelope from the elevator. The tickets showed 5 separate load weights and moisture readings across the 160 acres, all from Tanner's crew, all consistent. Alderman read each ticket twice. He handed the envelope back and said, "I said the wrong thing in December." Raymond looked at him. Alderman said, "I called you gone at the store." Raymond said, "I know." Alderman said, "I was wrong." Raymond said, "Come in for coffee." They sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. Alderman asked questions and Raymond answered them. The first time Raymond had explained anything to anyone about what he had done. The formal reckoning with Dr. Gordon Hatch came more quietly and took longer, which was appropriate because Hatch's dismissal had been quieter and more official. The two farmers who had overheard Hatch's phone call in October 1983, the ones who had heard him say right off, had spoken that December to an attorney in Marshall named Patricia Colvin on an unrelated matter and had mentioned the conversation. Colvin noted it without acting at the time. In January 1985, after the harvest figures had become known across the county, Colvin wrote a letter to the University of Missouri Cooperative Extension Service on behalf of a group of Saline County farmers who had received official extension guidance following the September 1983 floods. The letter documented Hatch's stated assessment of affected farms, cited the Cole farm results as direct evidence that the assessment had been premature and consequential, and requested a formal review of the Extension Office's standard protocol for flood-damaged bottomland. The university responded in April 1985. A review panel, 3 soil scientists from the Columbia campus, spent 2 days in Saline County, including a full day walking Raymond's treated fields and reviewing his records. Raymond showed them Chester's composition books, the yield tickets, the silt application records he had kept in a new composition book of his own, and the Craw's Harrow maintenance log. The panel said nothing dramatic. They took notes. Their written report, issued in July 1985, did not censure Hatch by name, but it specifically revised the Extension Service's recommended protocol for flood-stripped bottomland in Missouri River systems, replacing the 8 to 12-year rehabilitation timeline with a new framework that included silt collection and stratified application as a primary recovery method. The revision cited the Cole farm results directly and by name. Hatch's name appeared in the report only in acknowledgement of his cooperation with the review process. Hatch was reassigned to a research position at the Columbia campus in the fall of 1985. The position was described in the official announcement as a promotion. It involved no county-level farmer contact. The protocol revision reached 3 additional counties in Missouri by 1986. In Chariton County to the north, a farmer named Douglas Kerr had lost 80 acres of bottomland in the same September 1983 flooding event, and had received the same official guidance: rest the ground, commercial inputs, 8 to 12 years, and had struggled through 2 consecutive failed partial recovery seasons when his county extension agent, a younger man who had read the 1985 Missouri revision, drove to his property in spring 1986 with a copy of the new protocol and a description of what a farmer in Saline County had done. Care implemented the silt method on 60 acres that spring. His 1986 yield on the treated ground averaged 71 bushels per acre, not 81, because the silt deposit on his property was shallower and his timeline compressed, but 71 bushels where the old protocol would have produced 18 to 22. Care never met Raymond Cole. He sent a letter to the Saline County Extension Office addressed to the farmer who used the creek silt. The letter sat in a stack of mail for 2 weeks before someone mailed it to Raymond's address. Raymond read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in July 1986. He folded it and placed it in the ammunition box with Chester's composition books. He did not write back. There was nothing he could add that the letter had not already answered. In spring 1987, a graduate student from the University of Missouri Soil Science Department contacted Raymond by phone and asked if he would be willing to be interviewed for a research paper on post-flood soil recovery methods. Raymond said he would answer questions but would not allow the farm to be used as a study site. The student asked him to describe the source of his method. Raymond said his father had kept records. The student asked if he could see them. Raymond said they were not research materials. They were his father's books and they were staying where they were. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Raymond described the silt application process in full. The 2-inch depth standard, the 5.5-inch disc setting, the decision against supplemental nitrogen, the probe measurement system. The paper was published in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in 1988, citing Raymond Cole as a contributing source. His copy arrived in a manila envelope from Columbia. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in the ammunition box. By 1991, Raymond had restored the yield average on the treated 160 acres to within 4 bushels of his pre-flood benchmark. The ground had taken 7 years to fully rebuild its organic matter layer, not 8 to 12, but 7, and each year's crop residue incorporated back into the soil had advanced the recovery on a timeline that Chester's journal, written in 1943, had anticipated within a range of 1 year either way. Raymond turned 73 in 1992. He had farmed continuously for 46 years. He had not missed a bank payment since 1975. The Super M farmall still occupied the first bay of the machine shed. Its oil changed every 100 hours. Its maintenance log still taped to the inside of the toolbox lid where Raymond had placed it in 1963 and never moved it. His granddaughter, Leslie, was 19 in 1992 and had grown up spending summers on the farm. She helped with harvest that year, running the grain cart with the old 1973 International 666 tractor, while Tanner's combines worked the south field. On a Friday afternoon in late September between cart loads, she walked to where Raymond stood at the south headland looking at the field. She stood beside him. After a minute she said, "Why do you still use the old disc harrow? The craws. Tanner said there's a newer one that would do the same work twice as fast." Raymond crouched and pressed his palm flat against the soil at the headland edge, the way he had crouched in October 1983 and pressed his palm against the silt deposit. He lifted his hand and turned it over. A thin film of soil clung there, dark now, loamy, nothing like the pale material he had pressed 9 years earlier. He stood, he said, because I know what it does at 5.5 inches and I know how it does it. New equipment gives you new questions. The craws gives me answers. Leslie looked at the field. She said, "What kind of answers?" Raymond looked at the field too. He said, "The kind that tell you whether you're doing it right." That fall, Raymond walked the south field with Leslie on a Sunday morning, the harvest finished, the stubble gray in the October light, and explained everything. The silt collection, the depth measurement, the probe, the disc setting, Chester's journal, the 1943 yield figures, the decision against nitrogen, the 2 winters of work before the first spring planting. Leslie asked questions at each stop, and Raymond answered them. When they reached the inside bend of Corbin Creek, where the first silt deposit had been 18 inches deep in the fall of 1983, Raymond stood and looked at the creek. The water ran clear over a gravel bed, ordinary. Leslie said, "What are you looking at?" He said, "The source." The South Field today looks like every other good bottomland field in Saline County. It produces consistently. The topsoil layer, rebuilt from silt and crop residue and time, and the patient, documented application of a method that a man in Cooper County had begun observing in 1937, runs 8 to 10 inches deep across most of the field, measured from the surface to the B-horizon contact. A soil probe pushed into the ground at the creek bend comes up dark and loamy and cool, smelling of iron and organic matter, and the kind of moisture that indicates a living soil, not a rebuilt one. The Farmall Super M still stands in the first bay of the machine shed. It holds pressure. The maintenance log is still in the toolbox, still taped to the lid, still in Raymond Cole's handwriting. The Craw's disc harrow sits in the second bay, its bearing assemblies inspected each season, its depth-setting bolts marked at 5.5 inches with a file notch Raymond cut with a triangular file in the fall of 1983 and never moved. Chester Cole's composition books are in the ammunition box under the workbench. The 1943 volume is marked with a piece of torn grain sack at the entry for spring 1943. What Raymond Cole understood, what his father understood before him and committed to pencil in a 40-cent notebook, was that a flood does not destroy fertility. It redistributes it. The farmer who reads the aftermath as loss has already determined his outcome. The farmer who reads it as movement has a different set of questions to ask, and the answers to those questions, worked out slowly across frozen fields in the dark before sunrise, turn out to be the same questions the land was asking all along. The silt came from somewhere. It went somewhere. Raymond simply decided where. That is not a method that can be purchased at an extension office. It can only be inherited or earned or both.